I'm Mary Lou Slinkard. I was born in Gravette, on a little farm outside of Gravette, and in 1943. My parents were farmers, of course, and my mother, of course, was a homemaker, and just a little farm out there. But then they did get jobs in Bentonville, and then I was one of 7 children born there at the old home place. And
so what was it like growing up as a young child in a small town
of Gravette? Okay, of course I didn't live in town then. We lived out in the country, and I attended Gravette schools, of course, from the 1st grade through the 12th, and right after, and I graduated there in 1961. Took a job in 1962 at the KAMO radio station in Rogers, and at that time I lived with my aunt and walked from 4th Street to the job. And at that time the radio station was atop the First National Bank in Rogers, so I became familiar with that area. And then I don't know, I changed jobs. I wanted to change jobs, so I visited with at that time is Mrs. Terry Cherry at the, well, it's workforce development now, but unemployment office, I think is what it was called. And I asked her for a job. She said, "I've got one just for you." And it was attorney in Bentonville, Arkansas, and I went for an interview there, and he hired me, and I worked for Mr. Charles Gosho for 17 and a half years.
So what was that like? What was Charles like, and what was it like working as an attorney's secretary back in those days?
Oh, it was, of course, everything was totally new to me. Of course, at that time, we only had 5 attorneys in Bentonville, and of course, a couple of those I knew quite well, 3 or 4 of them. Clayton Little and Bill Enfield, who later became a circuit judge. Clayton Little was the attorney for Cooper Communities when they started Bella Vista Village, but you know, the legal work was something that I enjoyed learning, I think. And of course we drafted lots of wills. We also did, back then in those days, we did title opinions, a lawyer's opinion on the abstract of a piece of property. We did lots of land sales contracts. I also remember doing estate closings or loan closings with the Farmers Home Administration. And then I had one experience with working with an estate in probate court. The IRS agent out of Fayetteville came to the office, and I worked with that agent about the estate tax return, which was a new experience, of course, for me. And I enjoyed the legal work. I learned a lot, and of course during those things, of course, I met lots of people around the county, and I just, you know, and all the lawyers. I mean, there was only 5 or 6 in Bentonville at that time, and then I decided to pursue running for public office. I didn't think that I would, I knew, I told them at the time that I was recruited by a former friend of mine, and he was county assessor, I think, at the time, and I asked him about a job at the courthouse, and then that's when he became, he said, "You've got to run for county clerk." And I'm going, "Oh, I can't speak to people. I don't know how to public speak." And but then I did, and I was first elected on November the 4th, 1980, and I took office January I think we couldn't get into the office till January the 2nd. The swearing in was on the 1st, of course, And but then there was an incident that happened at the courthouse. Back then, the courthouse housed all the circuit clerk, the county clerk, the assessor, collector, treasurer, and at that time, I believe the county judge's office was upstairs also. And but all the elected officials are right there in the building. One other thing about the building that I remember was that we had a fallout shelter in the basement where the current prosecuting attorney's office is, I understand. And of course, and then in a few years, of course, they started remodeling and changing things around and all that. But we only had one circuit judge courtroom at that time, the very large courtroom. And we had an experience one time when Mr. Hal Holbrook, who is an actor, was going to do a film at the old courthouse, courtroom. And we had the pleasure of meeting him. We've met lots of people that way. But one of the duties, well, there were several duties of the office of the county clerk. And the one that I enjoyed the most, I think, was the elections and voter registration. And back then, of course, voter registration, a person, in order to register to vote, we had, I don't know how many precincts, but we had several precincts around the county, lots of townships. And but a voter, if you wanted to register to vote, you had to sign an affidavit of registration before the clerk or their deputy. And in fact, that's in-person registration. And of course, the voter registration cards then had to be typed on a typewriter with a carbon, because there was one for the Republicans, one for Democrat, one for the files, and then the original had to stay in the files, and one for the voter. So we had carbon copies of 4 affidavits of registration that had to be typed with names and precincts and so forth, school districts and all of that. That's where we also then learned about the different school districts and what the millage rates were. But well, I can get into that later. But all the different millage rates had to, of course, to be signed or done by the secretary of the quorum court. So the quorum court would have to pass the ordinance actually taking in all of these things. So there was a process before that where we had all the school districts, and then we had the great big books, leather-bound books, to post how the taxes went to each one of those school districts and each one of the things within the school district. So, and we always had Springdale, which was school district 50 in Washington County, and whether or not they got any road tax and things like that. So we had some things. But back to voter registration. At that time, we had these very large binders that had a lever that you could move after you inserted a card with all those holes. You could move them up and down so they fell into place alphabetically. So, and those big books were in these huge roller shelves. They were metal, and they were by precinct. And so on election day, all of those big binders would have to be sent out to the precincts for voting. One of the things then, at that time, we had paper ballots, I believe. Sorry. I'm going to have to cut that. We had, and then in 1978, we got what was called the punch card voting system. And on that, the IT guy would had a punch card thing to program how the counting would, how to count paper or punch card ballots. I can't think. The punch card ballots. But there was then we had to devise a way for a punch card ballot to be sent out for absentee voting. So it had to be stapled on a little styrofoam with a stylus for the voter to punch out the dot by the number of the candidate that they wanted to vote for. So there was a sample ballot there, or sample listing, and then they would have to punch out that. So, and one of the interesting things about the voter registration even was that we began to get some fraudulent people who, and I remember having to call Los Angeles County, California, because we had, at that time they had to present ID, a birth certificate, something. We had 5 birth certificates that all had the same doctor, white out, and anyway, that was just one of the things that happened where we could not register that person. The other thing was about the voting itself, the voting system itself, was that then all of those, we had to supply ballot boxes, stub boxes, and the voters list that was on a green bar, computer paper back then, and the voters' binders that the voter would actually sign. But then one of the things then that as we had absentee voting, then people would come to the office of the county clerk. By that time we had moved into a little bit larger office, but it was still at the same part of the courthouse. But I remember not helping, but Mr. Sam Walton came to the office to absentee vote, and of course we supplied him with the supplies that he needed, but he actually had to sit out in the lobby because we didn't have a place for anybody to stand at the voting machines. Just some things like that. Some of the other duties of the county clerk, though, of course, were as secretary to the quorum court, which, of course, the JPs. At that time, I think we only had 7, maybe. But it was, you have to take minutes of the quorum court meetings and decipher those. You keep track of all the ordinances and resolutions of the quorum court. I can't remember what else, but anyway, some of those things. So you attended all the meetings. We used to meet at the County Public Service Building out on 102, and we had fold-up tables and just folding chairs. We finally got microphones out there in that office, and so. But at the time, and then I think it was in '95 they started talking about building this administration building, and so that we'd have more room, and they had to build courtrooms at the courthouse and things like that. So we started then about building this county administration building, and we moved out of the courthouse in, I think it was in 1996. June of 1996 is when the counties moved. They moved us over to here to this building, and that reminds me of at the old courthouse we had a vault, and the door was probably 6 inches of steel wide, but where that vault was in the courthouse, there were barred windows on the front of the courthouse. So you can see them right now, the front of the courthouse. That's where our vault was, and that's where we kept all of those record books that were leather bound, have all those records in it. And I thought, and then finally, I think we had that door removed whenever we got ready to move, because we had to move all of those old records out to a different building, to an archives building, and none of them would come over here. And then eventually I think we got some automated filing cabinets that we didn't have to use filing cabinets anymore, and things like that. But we used to have to post by hand, as I said, the taxes. We had different colored warrants, you might call them, for the county general, the county road fund, and the different cities and all of that. And we'd have to post each little amount as we collected, especially delinquent taxes. We didn't actually, well, we collected it, but then we passed the money over with the record to the county treasurer. So we always had to be in close proximity of those other offices.
Well, what did you do in your office to automate some of the things that were being done by hand over the years? What were some
Okay, well, some of the things, and I think that was in well, I can't remember the date, but later on, David Caldwell was the county collector, and the collector and assessor then didn't move over here. They moved to the old post office building, which is now a courtroom, I think, or something. But so the collector was doing, he was talking about different computer programs to calculate, so you wouldn't have to have a calculator at every desk. Okay, so to calculate the different taxes and stuff, as he was talking about these computer programs. And the assessor had some type of computer, but it wasn't PCs. It was something, it was the great big IBM computers. And so we got to talking and about how that was the beginning of PCs, a personal computer. And I knew they had a Bentonville enrichment education program here in Bentonville, and I took a Lotus 1, 2, 3 class, okay? And I was thinking, boy, that would just be perfect if I could do calculation in Lotus 1, 2, 3. So that was my first program, was to do a Lotus 1, 2, 3, writing the macros and that sort of thing. And then eventually, of course, we got PCs and the software to do that kind of thing, and it was doing spreadsheets, and I can do spreadsheets in Excel now. So, and that's what we did. We started doing that, and then we got the Word, so we could use Word Perfect with all of our different forms and things like that.
Speaking of forms, I know that you had professional colleagues from other parts of the state that you knew, and you were kind of known for your forms. Talk about that a little bit.
Okay. Well, I mean, I guess doing everything by hand, or somebody would call up and want to know about so-and-so and so-and-so. How do you do an annexation? How do you do so-and-so? How do you do so-and-so? So I'd get it out, and I'm thinking, well, it says right here, just do it this way, So I created some forms, especially about, oath of office form, or the certificate of election, just all those different kinds of things that was required to be filed. And then we had the candidate petitions, or the candidate forms that had to be filed. And so we just created a bunch of those, and we would share those with others across the state. And of course, a lot of the conferences, that's what we did. The other part I want to talk about a little bit was about the probate court office. Of course, we were in charge of your probate court clerk. And so as a court clerk, you deal with, the attorneys bringing in the estate files, and filing estates and collecting the money and doing all that. You get familiar with, then assignment of judges, and that's become now pretty well automated. And so you deal with even state offices that way too, with the state, not Supreme Court, but the clerk, and you deal with Secretary of State. You deal with mainly the Secretary of State as a state office during those times as county clerk. And so, when I first went into office, we had Paul Revere as Secretary of State. I can't remember who after him. Then Charlie Daniels or Bill McEwen, Charlie Daniels, Mark Martin, and now John Thurston. So there were several of those folks that we worked closely with in dealing with some of the issues of the county clerk's office.
What about the different county judges you've worked for over the years? Can you kind of give me an idea of how many there were?
Well,
maybe
yeah.
Some of the ones that.
Well, the very first one, of course, was Mr. Al Norwood. I think he went out the year I came in, but no, he was here. He went out in '81. But Mr. Al Norwood was the first one, and I think I can't remember all their names right now off the top of my head, but Clyde Cummings, Bruce Rutherford, Gary Black was the latest ones.
Talk about some of those guys. Gary Black, what was he like as a county judge?
Well, of course, I'd known Gary as a kid. I call him a kid, but I'd known him for a while too. And so, yeah, we got along really well. And I did. But I think I most remember Al Norwood, even though he was of a different political party than me. He took me to his political party picnic at Little Flock. Because we all got, and I think that's one of the things that the old courthouse did for us, was that we had a camaraderie of the elected officials at that time. And it seemed like as we moved on, it kind of seemed like we lost our contact in a way, because everybody was doing, it was kind of separated. It seemed like to me, but that's just my observation of what happened. But yeah, and then of all the state officials, my certificates are signed by, well, first of all, is Bill Clinton as governor, and I've got them signed by every governor since then, since 1980 up through the time that I then ran for state rep.
So talk about your decision to run for state rep and what led you to do that, and then what you did once you're in there.
Okay, all right. Well, I really didn't make I guess I didn't. I don't know. I was at a Republican committee meeting, and I don't know. I guess God just told me that's what I was going to do, because I got up and announced I was going to run. But I got up and announced that I was going to run for the wrong district. And then, but Tim Summers was running at the time, and he said, and this was in 2008. And he said, "No, that's my district." And I said, "Oh, I mean District 100." So, and I just started in running. And back then, running for public office, well, even back to county clerk, you can really spend some money. But back in the running for office as county clerk, see, that was every 2 years. And so we went to every chicken barbecue and every parade in the county, and every place that you could go find to speak and tell people that you're running. It became different, though, in running for state representative, and that as those times changed, then there wasn't as many chicken barbecues or pie suppers or fish fries and things like that to attend to get acquainted. So with the voters, and it was a little bit different.
Well, when you were in office, one of your highlights or one of your career achievements was the changes in the voter laws. Can you talk about those?
Yes, I will. And that was my cup of tea, having been that county experience and that sort of thing. It was, we had worked on this before, and I had, as I said, I attended many conferences. At one point, of course, I served on the State Board of Election Commissioners. And then at one point, I was appointed at that time when the Help America Vote Act was passed in 2002. And at that time, it required a standards board, Election Assistance Commission Standards Board. The Standards Board had to be made up of 2 people from each state. One of them was the chief election official of the state, which is the Secretary of State, and the other one of the opposite party had to be a county clerk. Well, guess what? I was then appointed to that Election Assistance Commission, and it was all about the Help America Vote Act and what it had to do with changing the laws. But there had to be standards for these election systems. And so we learned and looked at every election system I think there was at that time, and created those standards. And it's called NIST, the National Institute of something, anyway. I can't remember all of that. But that was an experience that I felt like helped me, especially even in the legislature, because we had made several changes in going to electronic poll books, going to modernizing, what we do, and there were lots of voting systems in the country at that time too. So we got to visit with the election center, all of those different election systems companies, and of course I think one was finally chosen, and then of course those have changed again now. But one of the things that I did then with that experience of having to draw precinct boundaries by hand at the time, because we didn't have a mapping system, we would have to draw precincts and then determine which precinct that a voter was going to be in based upon where they lived, their street address. And then on top of that, of course, were school district boundaries, fire district boundaries, constable boundaries, which was by township at that time. And so you had all these overlapping boundaries. And so it was very difficult sometimes and then we decided then to get paper maps, and we started drawing our precincts on that. And finally we got to where we could change the constable boundaries to match precinct boundaries. Okay, then of course now it's changed again, but what happened then was I saw an opportunity, I felt like, and I had help with this, of course, with the other colleagues in the legislature, to create where a person would not have to drive across, after they got off work, they wouldn't have to drive all the way across the county to go back to their precinct to vote and try to get there by 7:30. So we decided, and I had heard about this at some of the conferences I went to where they're talking about vote centers. Indiana, the state of Indiana has several. They started it, I think, because I talked with their Secretary of State. And so we got these ideas about how to create vote centers. And so that was one of the things that I think that I worked on in the legislature, that everybody seems to like them, that you don't have to go to your own precinct to vote. And so that way it's been able to reduce, you can have a vote center on election day. So, and as well as 2 weeks early voting. That was the other thing we worked on, was early voting. And first there was some, people didn't think that, was the right thing to do. But and then the absentee voting, of course, we had to send out military absentee voting. We had a kind of a unique situation in Benton County because of Walmart offices, and they were having people overseas or out of country, so they would have to vote absentee. So we always had a lot of absentee voters that way because of that situation.
What do you remember about the switch from blue to green to red, or the county switched from all Democrats to all Republicans?
Well, I wrote in the I rode in as a Republican on Ronald Reagan's coattails, I guess, in 1980. And then in 82 or 84, I think, we came along. I think Shirley Salmon came in as assessor. 84 was Gloria Spring. She's still here, too. Gloria Peterson, rather, as county collector. Or I think she was elected as treasurer back then. So she's, but you know, it just kind of started then, and then, and some of our legislators then were, of course, getting elected as Republicans. That party, it just seemed like it just kind of trailed. Everybody says, "Oh, I want to run," I guess, but. It was an experience.
Well, there was a time when, and maybe somewhat to a degree now, where whoever won in Benton County in the Republican Party essentially had enough votes to win the state because there were so few other ones in the state. Do you remember that far back?
Well, I do, because I was the only Republican county clerk in this state at the time. Until, and I don't know, it was up in the 90s before somebody else, another clerk, ran as Republican. I don't remember exactly who that was.
Asa Hutchison likes to tell the story about back in the day when there was just a handful or less Republican precincts in the county, and then I guess they worked a deal to combine them.
Yes,
Can you talk about that?
I sure will. I thought of that this morning at home. I thought, I'm going to talk about joint primaries, and that's when they got the punch card system. But there was a time where you had to have, and many counties still did that up until just recently, you had to have a separate voting place for Republicans and a separate voting place for Democrats. Okay, and then they got the law changed, I believe, to create joint primary election, where a voter would just choose which party ballot that they wanted. So you had to send out both the Democrat ballots and the Republican ballots. And so that was one of the things that voters took a little while to even learn about, is that, well, I'm a Democrat or I'm a Republican, you know, I want a Republican ballot, or whatever. But it took them a little while to realize that all they had to do is, because we don't have party registration in Arkansas. And even a lot of people would say, well, I'm a, whatever party. But for a candidate, we entered on their voter registration record the fact that they were a candidate of a party affiliation, and it wasn't necessary for any other voter, unless they wanted to put their party affiliation on the voter registration. But all the candidates had to have that on there so that their parties would know who to certify.
And you talked a lot about the parties. There's a feeling among a lot of people maybe that everything in politics is partisan. What about in the courthouse level? Do you see a lot of that?
I never did. I never did see anything like that. We worked with everybody in my office staff. I mean, in fact, when I first went into the office, I kept the employees that were there under the previous administration. And so, but even though I wasn't able to get into the office until January the 2nd, and then as we learned, as I said, we did everything by hand, and as we learned to kind of grow out of that and to get into, we shared, it seemed like we shared things and was able to work with everybody.
So, finish up telling about your legislative career.
Oh.
Are there other things you want to talk about besides the voter registration?
Oh,
you were in the House, and then later, did you run for Senate also?
Oh, no, I did not. No, I went into the House in 19...
Okay. You told me you served 3 terms in the House, so let's start back with there.
Okay.
And then you
Okay,
did what?
I retired in 2008, and so my first term was 2009 to 2011. Was my first term. And
So after you served 3 terms, then what did you do?
okay, well, I just totally retired after the 6 terms because I was term limited. But in 2018, they passed the term limit bill that you could run at that time. If you left the House, you could run for Senate. But the senator was Jim Hendren, I think, from Gravette, and I didn't want to run against him. I mean, there wasn't any need to. So I fully retired from the legislature at the end of 2014.
And then?
Oh, and then, right, okay, so I retired and I was out of office. I didn't know what I was supposed to do. I mean, it seemed like every Friday or every Sunday I was on my way to Little Rock. Every Friday I was on my way back home. And then, so after I, retired or was left the legislature, in January I was going, what am I supposed to do? I'm supposed to drive someplace. But, so I was off for about 6 months, and then I got a call from the governor who wanted, a man that was on the quorum court at that time had passed away. So there was a vacancy on the quorum court here in Benton County. And so I got a call from the governor wanting to appoint me to fill out that unexpired term. So that was in July of 15, and I served till December of 16 of the quorum court. Of course, I was familiar with the quorum court, having been secretary to the quorum court for all those years.
What about some of the JPs that stand out? You obviously know almost all of them, or over the years have. Who were some of the ones
Right, when we started out, as I said, we met in the public service building. I remember Royce Neese, Sidney Ness. There was another guy that wanted to do planning. He was against planning, but I can't remember his name. Sorry. And then that we just had. There was just a bunch of. I don't think we even had any women on the court back then either. But then after this building got built, of course, we had a quorum court meeting room. But before that, the back of my office, the back of the courthouse, there was an alley there. And I can't remember what year it was, but then the county and the city got together and said, because the old jail was built right there across the alley from the back door of the courthouse, okay, from where that fallout shelter was. And there was the jail. Well, on the part of that jail, at the top of that was some stairways, and the county judge's office had an office upstairs above the jail. That county judge, and I can't remember if it was, I can't remember what judge was up there, but several until they built this building. That's where we held the quorum court meetings. So I'd carry my tape recorder and my records, and we would go and take the minutes at the county judge's office at the quorum court meetings at that time. Then after we got this building, of course, they moved in here.
What are some of the stories that you have in mind that I haven't thought to ask about? I mean, what are some of the memories that you have that I haven't asked you to share?
Well, of course, I remember just being, I think, I couldn't believe that this gal, farm girl, could have accomplished some of the things. I think my mother would have been quite proud of me. She died when she was 64, and I wasn't even, well, anyway, she died in 1976. And I just think that she would have been quite proud of me. And even though I did, my dad wasn't too happy with me being a Republican, I think. because I had somebody walk into the law office and say, I knew him, and I thought he was a great friend of my parents and all this, and he said, I want to know how you get your old Democratic daddy to vote for you. And I said, because I'm his daughter. But anyway, I think looking back now on that, I've had so many opportunities, and I've appreciated every minute of it. I'm just humbled by and honored that I was able to do the things that I got to do for the county. And it kind of makes me teary, but.
What about the tremendous growth? I mean, what do you remember when you were talking earlier about you lived out in the country, you didn't live in town, but
Yeah. Oh, now we have paved roads out there. The old home place is gone, of course, but we have paved roads out in that area. But I remember as a girl growing up and going to high school, we had town kids and farm kids, and we rode a school bus over dusty roads and that sort of thing. But we had a good school system, and my parents and my mother especially, and all of the family were pioneers of Gravette. My great grandparents were pioneers of Gravette. That was just my hometown, and like I said, I couldn't believe a little old farm girl from Gravette could be ever elected to public office, and that was one of the things that I'm just really, really proud that I was able to do that.
Congratulations. A couple more questions there, and I'll wrap you up here. Who are some of the deputies or chief deputies that you've had over the years that that helped you run your office at the courthouse?
Oh, gee.
Or is there too many? Just mention a few.
There's several, but I want to mention a couple. Like I said, I kept the former employees in my office. And so I had opponents in 1982. I was elected in 1980. I had opponents in 1982, and one of them was I don't know if she was, I think she ran in 84. In 82, I know I had an opponent, but it could have been the deputy treasurer at that time, Miss Williams. Then my chief deputy was Shirley Davis. She ran against me. And then in 1986, I had, 3 or 4 people to run against me. But mainly after we moved over here, we had I had a good crew all the time, and they taught me a lot, and I understand that. But as we changed to all these different things, I haven't talked about marriage licenses yet. Then we got people in here. I hired a young lady. I knew her mother very well. In 1989, who became the county clerk after I left. And she got elected as county clerk, but now she's retired. But Tina O'Brien was my chief deputy for all those years. And I had, I can't even think of their names. I'm sorry.
That's okay.
If I could look at my picture, I could probably name them. But there were several that they did voter. We kind of sectionized our areas in the office so that these people did marriages, these people handled the money, these people did this, and the voter registration. Then we had elections, and then we finally got mapping, so that we could do our own maps. And that sort of thing. So, and there's several of them are still here. I think Nancy has retired, and a couple of the others have retired.
If somebody came to you, maybe from another part of the state or another state, and said, "Tell me about Benton County," what would you tell them?
I think the changes have. I just remember Bentonville as 3,500 people or so. we had 2 movie theaters. We had what do you call them, mercantile stores. We had the Blacks Ready to Wear, the Putman's Men's Store, the Putman's Ladies Store. We had a Camp Lefevre store there. All of those things that went by the wayside. And you knew everybody in town. I mean, not in town, but you knew people. We had Roy's Office Supply. That's where we bought office supplies, stationery and paper and whatever things. And the courthouse, the front steps of the courthouse were open. I think that's one of the things that I think even when we tried to install an elevator one time on the outside of those steps. I don't know if it's still there or not, but I haven't been there. But and then the renovation started, and it separated people. It seemed like to me, rather than the togetherness that we had experienced. Now about the county itself, it's growing so fast. So many people moving in every day that we don't have any of the history that I grew up with, that I think is important for our people to learn about our history. It's all changed. We don't have, yes, we're all modern and everything's nice and new and pretty and all of that, but if you don't have what it took to get here, then I think I'm lecturing, and I shouldn't do that. But I'm just saying that it's changed so much that it's hard for me to accept in a lot of ways, because I do miss the old days.